want to give you a bit of time to discuss not just the Hamas case, but also the backlash that you have received from that. Explain to me your involvement in this, how you came to be involved, where you are with that case, and then we'll maybe discuss the backlash you've received.
Absolutely. So there's a long answer and a short answer. I'll give you a medium answer. Basically, I want to pay homage to Fahad Ansari, who's the Irish Muslim solicitor who instructed me. Formidable man, just honestly such an honour to work with him. Like, he's taught me so much. He's so full of humility and courage, just an incredible man. And I know him because I wrote an article about 5 years ago called something like Asylum for Conscientious Objectors to Israeli Apartheid, ? And it was like, look, if you're a Jewish Israeli and you don't want to serve in the murderous Israeli occupation forces and you're thinking about claiming asylum in the UK, here's how you might do it, kind of thing. So I wrote this article being like, hey, does anyone want to do this? And then Fahad sent me an email and said, hey man, I've read your article and I have this Jewish Israeli client who wants to claim asylum in exactly the way you've just described. So we started working together. We don't support Hamas, or like, oh, I'm not going to talk about this in the terms that I might because I'm worried that I'm committing an offence, so it's a kind of a free speech argument. But more than that, I would say the more important human rights argument is the one that stems from dignity and thinking about Palestinian dignity, and the way that locking millions of people into an open-air concentration camp and telling them that they're literal animals, that they're racially inferior because they're not Jewish, is a disgusting affront to humanity and dignity, and that the foundation of human rights is that we should be concerned with humans and their needs, and one thing that we know as humans that we need is dignity, and some people will always refuse to live in a dignity. We know that from Bobby Sands, we know that from Nelson Mandela, we know that from the Palestinian people. So dignity, right to freedom of expression, right to elections, right to not be discriminated against, that's ground 2. And then ground 3 is this kind of quite, in some ways quite complex, multifaceted argument about the practical consequences of deprescription and prescription, right? So when you make Hamas illegal and you consider the fact that they form they are integral to the civilian administration of Gaza. When you think about what it means to try to provide aid to that civilian infrastructure, when you think about what it means to just even speak to people in Gaza at a moment when they're facing a genocide, the deprescription is necessary for the aid to flow in and for support to Palestinian people to flow in the way that it needs to. That's the argument in a nutshell.
And since then, obviously, the high profile of that case means that, and a lot of this work, we know, it was almost as if you just appeared, but we know that you've been hammering away behind the scenes on this kind of human rights work for years. But the backlash you received, it was quite sudden. Did you expect it to come as quick as it did? Were you prepared for that?
Yeah, I think I was prepared. Like, I come from South Armagh and I work in the English legal sector. Like, it's difficult to imagine a more racist, sexist, transphobic, just obnoxious part of British society. Like, the British legal sector was just, like, honestly stuck in the 19th century. It's insane. Like sexism. Like, I see female colleagues and they'll appear in front of judges and it's just jaw-dropping. Like, what passes for acceptable behaviour among judges and colleagues and all the rest of it. So it's an obnoxious place, and I spent almost a decade practicing there. More than that if you count the time I spent training, right? So in some ways I was well acquainted to it, and I think a lot of people with less staunch communist, anti-imperialist politics would have maybe bent a bit. I think that's what tends to happen. People with decent political instincts go into an extremely small C conservative sector and then they just allow themselves to kind of go with the flow kind of thing, whereas like coming from South Armagh, it was just like, I'm not really going to go with the flow. I don't agree with the colonial occupation of my country. I don't agree with capitalism. I'm here to fight it. And I think I've tried to stay tethered to the movement and make myself very accountable to the workers' movement, to the Palestinian movement. And I'm not that bothered about what my colleagues and what the legal sector thinks of me. So I think that helped. And at the risk of being overly playful, this is an anecdote that I had retired because I used it so much that it's like one of those pebbles that's been worn smooth by the tide. It's like so overused, but it's very apt for an Irish audience. When I was a pupil, right, which is the pretentious word for an apprentice or whatever, when I was training to be a barrister, we went to this mandatory weekend training session with all of the other people at the Inns of Court, as it's called, right? So I'm surrounded by all these trainee barristers and all these judges and senior lawyers and stuff. And they were training us how to do the job, and in some ways it was quite useful. And then one of the evenings we were dining together and someone came and said, can we have 2 volunteers? So I put my hand up, not knowing what I was volunteering for, and they took me to...
Never do that.
Yeah, they took me to another room where all the judges and cases and all, or QCs as they were then, were dining. So I'm just surrounded, me and this other poor bastard are just surrounded by all these members of the judiciary. And I was just like, oh, here I am, I had a few glasses of wine, and there's a High Court judge sat here, QC there, and there was some judge here talking to everyone across the tables who I think had a brother in the British Army or whatever, and I was like, right, here we are at the belly of the British establishment. And your man starts saying, this was in the Corbyn years, yeah, and he was like, oh, the problem with Jeremy Corbyn, he'll never be elected because he's an IRA sympathiser. So I just said, again, a few glasses of wine, I just said, what's wrong with sympathising with the IRA? Obviously, the whole table just went quiet, and they just went, did he just say what I think he said? So your man is just left to answer for the British establishment, and it wasn't a statement, right? There may be reasons not to sympathise with the IRA. It was a question, right? What's wrong with sympathising with the IRA? And he said, he stuttered some answer like, oh, they're murderers. And I said, oh, how many hundreds of thousands of Iraqis are the IRA responsible for murdering? And he just... Dude, I grew up in South Armagh. I've been having these arguments since I was fucking 5 years old. Like, and he's just this idiot who's just like, oh, I don't like murder. And it's like, her brother's in the British Army. Don't, like, be serious, right? So it's like, I think something clicked for me in that moment. I was like, oh, they're idiots. Like, they're not used to, like, we who grow up in your colonies have to have these arguments because we'll get beat up if we say the wrong answer to these questions. And you're just like, I don't like murder. It's like, just be serious, dude. Like, so I think once that clicked into place for me, that was like almost 10 years ago now, like, honestly, there's a certain kind of judge who has a degree of intellectual seriousness where they're not used to hearing arguments, but if you say it, they'll just nod along and go, you know what, that's right. And this is what happened, I think, in this case with the solicitor I was telling you about, that we just had the High Court judgment on Wednesday. Like, I argued that a month ago, and I was just in the English High Court, and I just said to your man, I was just like, hey, the IHRA definition says that it's anti-Semitic to suggest that Israel's a racist endeavor. I was like, 750,000 people were expelled from their country because they were deemed a racial threat. That sounds kind of racist, but also fast forward to today, the ICJ says it's an apartheid state. Is an apartheid state a racist endeavor? And he was just like, yeah, that must be right. And he wrote a really helpful judgment being like, yeah, you're allowed to call for Israel to cease to exist. That's literally what he said in the High Court. You're allowed to call for Israel to cease to exist, and that's not anti-Semitic. That's the discourse.
Just before we go to the audience, I do think that, and I mean, I'm hearing the role of the media in this has been pretty disgraceful from the start, part of the world anyway. So this is the first time, I think, that we've ever seen in the world where the population itself is having to report on its own genocide. If it wasn't for the journalists who have been actively targeted in Gaza themselves, but ordinary people we've seen have had to just literally pick up a phone and record their own demise, and that's the only way we're getting news out of that. And that is not an accident. That is purposely, it's a purpose tactic of war, is to stop that information. And if it wasn't for those people reporting it themselves, but also attacks on people such as yourself or anyone who tries to speak up. I mean, you can look at my Twitter account. It's just full of people saying I should be sacked. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I've come under a degree of attack. I don't want to overstate it compared to what the Palestinians are going through. Obviously, I think you're right to emphasise the journalists who are being deliberately targeted and murdered, right? And I saw Abu Bakr Abed has fled to Dublin, right? He's
and I don't think the NUJ was strong enough on that at the start. I mean, I know they've come out now, but at the beginning they weren't strong enough in the fact that journalists were being murdered, deliberately murdered in Gaza.
So I think the most useful way to riff off of what you're saying is to point out that the best defense is a good offense. Like, almost always. There are a few circumstances where that's not true, on which I'm happy to advise you, but broadly, when someone comes to me and says, oh, I'm being attacked for, you know, I'm being accused of anti-Semitism for criticising Israel, whatever, the best defense is almost always a good offense. And so that was my attitude when they came from me. I tweeted a bunch of stuff on October 7th, as a lot of us did. I said victory to the Intifada on October 7th. I shared an image of that beautiful image of the bulldozer breaking through the apartheid fence. And Zionist freaks tried to privately prosecute me, and the British state, because they were trying to prosecute me under the Terrorism Act, the DPP had to provide consent. And so I got this bizarre email from the cops saying, oh, Mr. Magennis, some people will try to prosecute you. Like, what do you have to say about that? So I got my friends at Burnbury Pierce to write them an email, so we managed to bat that away, and then they dragged me in front of my regulator, the Bar Standards Board, and said, this man's a terrorist and he shouldn't be allowed to practice law. And again, this happened to a lot of my colleagues, and without naming names, I think that the instinct was to be defensive and to hunker down and to delete your Twitter account or whatever. I honestly think that what the British state and what the Zionist state is not used to is people just going on the offensive and just saying, I don't give a fuck what you think of me. I don't care what the British state has to tell me about how to system. I wrote, again, my friend Fahad Ansari represented me in those BSB proceedings, obviously didn't blink, caught the ball, that's comradeship, and I will be forever grateful to him for the way that he stood in my corner when I was facing those attacks. And he said, look, just go away and write a witness statement. My friend Katie is in the audience. We went to watch the Palestinian women's football team playing in Dublin against the Bows or whatever. And I started drafting the first draft of that when I was hungover to fucking Dublin airport or whatever. And I was like, I am writing this in Dublin airport. And I ended up writing this 25-page witness statement. I'm supposed to be defending these tweets that I've written, and they're like, you're anti-Semitic and a terrorist and you shouldn't practice as a lawyer. And I ended up just writing this short kind of biography of like how much I fucking hate the British Empire. And I was just like, and it, literally the final paragraph of that witness statement, where I'm supposed to be defending myself, was word for word. As my brother is my witness, and in the name of all that is sacred, glorious to the resistance and its martyrs, victory to the Intifada. And the British state read that and went, as you were. Like, they backed away slowly, and I think that's because they can see that there's a sleeping dog of Irish republicanism, and they don't want to wake up that dog. And we should step into that, like, and we shouldn't fetishize ourselves as Irish people. We are, like, the working class has no country, and when we say in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians, we need to negate that and say Palestinians are all us. We are all human. You don't, the point is not to die on the hill, right? The hill is Palestine. The point is not to die on the hill. The point is to love the hill so much that you live on it and that you refuse to leave it. And if necessary, we will die on that hill. But the hope is to live on the hill. The hill is Palestine. The hill is the world. Like, Chuck Yarla, like, fuck the Brits and fuck the